local news and find yourself wondering how some of those stories qualify as being newsworthy? To me, the real stories are not the stories that are being reported to us. They are the stories behind the stories. Those are the stories I'm interested in. Years ago, there was an article written about me in a local journal. I can't remember the name of the journal, but it was along the lines of the Bellevue Reporter, only it circulated out in the north end of Seattle. They didn't identify me by name in the article. And actually, it's a stretch to call it an article. Really, it was a blurb. I was in a section called Police Blotter. Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and honored guests if we had any. I assure you I did not commit any crimes. I was working as a delivery driver for Pizza Haven at the time. One night I had a delivery out to a house, and it turns out there was a kegger going on. It was a weekend, late at night, and people were out of control there. Malcontents, every one of them. And admittedly, my customer service skills probably could have used some work. I ended up getting in a scuffle with one of the guests. My part of it was just to defend myself. I did call the police. They came out. Nothing really happened. I certainly did not talk to any reporters. Yet a couple days later, I ran across this write-up of the incident in this journal. And I remember as I read it thinking, that's not the way it went down. First of all, it made me look bad, so I didn't like it right away. And more importantly, it wasn't accurate. And I don't know who wrote it, but I think whoever it was probably had a police scanner and heard the calls that came across the radio. But the bigger issue was it was sensationalized. And ever since then, I've always approached local news with an attitude of skepticism. When I watch the local news now, it's clear to me that the industry treats us as like we were pieces on a game board. The object, of course, is to capture as many of us as they can, and they will resort to feeding us stories that have absolutely no news value, as long as they think they can elicit some emotion from us, get us hooked, and ultimately garner our viewership. There's a couple of these stories from this past summer still lingering around in my head. The first one has to do with a guy from Australia. He was pulled over for a traffic violation in Australia. And maybe I'm too structured in my thinking, but in my mind that breaks a rule about local news. Anyway, the police officer got up to the car, and he noticed that the driver had a case of beer buckled into the back seat between two adults, while his 5-year-old son was riding on the hump in the middle of the floor. They interviewed the police officer, and he expressed outrage that beer would take priority over a child, and that a child would ride in the car unrestrained, and the driver was fined the equivalent of $700 US. When I heard this story, my first question was, where was the news? When I was a kid, I used to ride in the back of my dad's 1963 GMC pickup. Everywhere we went, my dad would drive, and I would sit in the bed, back up on the wheel well, usually with a cheeseburger in one hand and a milkshake in another. That's the way I rolled. That's the way most of us rolled back then. Later in life, as I got older and had a job and was old enough to drive, I bought that 63 GMC pickup off my dad. And I can assure you, I know the difference between beer and children. And I would never handle a case of beer the way I handle a child. I would never shove a case of beer up on the wheel well and drive around. You know how foamy beer gets. My rule is beer rides in the cab. That's not a crime, that's common sense. Going back to the story in Australia, it would have been a better idea to put the kid in the seatbelt and the beer on the floor, but it still wasn't newsworthy in my opinion. What that was a news director casting out a story, trying to elicit emotion and get us hooked, and ultimately get us to watch their newscasts. But the most blatant example of this manipulation was in July. That's when a 20-year-old guy named Spencer Taylor, who will be forever famous now, showed up at a theater in Michigan to watch the new Batman movie, Dark Knight. He showed up in full costume as the Joker. Green wig, makeup, lipstick, purple suit. While he was there, he tried to steal a couple posters out of the lobby and some other Batman memorabilia that was on display. He was arrested. The first that I heard of this story was when I walked into the break room on the 8th floor. It was on CNN. And I thought, how does a guy who shows up as the Joker and steal a poster end up on CNN? And then I got home and it was on my local news. How does that happen? Here's some perspective for you. Back in the late 70s, one Saturday night, I went down to the University District and saw a movie called The Rocky Horror Picture Show. And I can tell you that a guy dressed as the Joker would not get a second look. I saw men in fishnet stockings with garter belts and high heels. I saw women in wedding gowns. When I watched the movie, at one point I was hit in the back of the head with a piece of toast. I looked up and there were rolls of toilet paper streaming toward the screen. And when I came out of the movie, I had to shake rice out of my hair. What I think is happening is that the public relations team at Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers are the distributor, caught wind of that story, got a hold of their contacts at the television station because they saw an opportunity to leverage that into some ticket sales. And so they were trying to drum up some business, create the same kind of fervor that fans of the Rocky Horror Picture Show have for that movie. I encourage all of you to approach the news with an attitude of skepticism. Look for the story behind the story. It's good practice just for your Toastmaster skills, your critical analysis, and it will help protect you from being pushed around like a piece on a game board, and that is a good thing. Have a good afternoon. Mr. Toastmaster.